G'day, welcome everyone, thanks for coming along today. My name's Caitlin, I'm on the TJA committee, and welcome. This is our very first session in the new series on funding a Better Aotearoa, why we need more revenue. So on behalf of Tax Justice Aotearoa and the Victoria University School of Government, kia ora koutou katoa, welcome. So Tax Justice Aotearoa, for anyone who hasn't been along before, I can definitely see we've got some familiar faces in the room, is an NGO who wants tax reform to be unavoidable at the next election. And Better Taxes is our new campaign. We're partnered with 26 NGOs nationwide. So very excited about getting that message further. A little bit of admin before we start. Fire exits, we've got a door right out there and another set of doors that way. So you just head to the street. I haven't been able to find the toilets, but I could see that there was a sort of map that way. Oh, you know where they are?
Yeah, it's the first picture, halfway down the hall.
Perfect, so that's first corridor halfway down the hall. Earthquakes underneath. Everyone online, I trust you'll have yourselves sorted. And then as far as we go for running today, we're going to have our chair, Glenn Barclay, introduce the series in just a moment, and then afterwards we're going to welcome on our speaker, Tayla. So I'll hand you over to Glenn now.
Tēnā koutou katoa. I'm just going to take a short couple of minutes to talk about the series, because we've run these Tax on Tuesday series before. This time the focus of the series is about how do we fund the services we need better. So it's about why do we need to grow revenue. Because the discussion about tax is too often about do we want this tax or that tax, and not about why we want better taxes. So it's about time that we tried as an organisation and as a coalition to address that question. So we're really lucky to have Tayla here today, and Kate will introduce her properly in a second. But other ones in this series, the next one will be Shamavil Jacob talking about infrastructure. That's on the 2nd of September. On the 16th, we're going to have one on education, and then after that, we get a bit loose as to what's in what order, but we definitely have some. It's going to be one on poverty and inequality. There's going to be one on climate with Rod Carr. And there's going to be one at the end on a capable state and why we need to properly resource a capable state. So I just wanted to give a plug for this series. It's really important to us. It's going to be important for our campaign as well. And for those of you online and everyone, we will be reaching out to you after this as well to see what you think and to see if you're interested in being involved with the campaign. So with that, I'll hand over back to Caitlin.
So not much more talking from me, just to introduce Tayla. So Tayla Forward today is here, and she is a researcher in economics and political economy, a fellow at the World Inequality Lab, a research associate at both Victoria University and the University of Canterbury, and a current postgraduate at the Paris School of Economics. And Tayla's here today to talk to the value of public expenditure and the economic faults in austerity logic. So with a round of applause, can we welcome Tayla to the stage?
Hi everyone, kia ora, ko wai koe, no te tai tokira au, ko Ngāpuhi te iwi, ko Tayla Forward tōku ingoa. And I'm not sure if people online can see that something weird looks like it's going on the screen, so I'm just going to click some things and see what happens. All good. Oh, no, yep, great, excellent. So all going well, I can sort of project this screen that people in the room are seeing onto this, what the people online are seeing. That's going to work, do we think?
Yes, efficient screen.
Ta-da. Does that seem likely?
Yeah, also, oh, that's better. Oh no.
Yes.
Also enter the presenter mode.
Yeah, awesome. You want to help me with that? Slideshow? Is that that?
Yeah, that should work.
Great. How does that look to people online as well? All well and good? Cool. Great. So, first of all, just wanted to thank everyone for coming along in your lunch break or this dreary afternoon. And for everyone for joining online, to Tax Justice Aotearoa for having us here and bringing us all together for hopefully a fun discussion. And of course to Mana Whenua for the land that we're having this talk on. Just to motivate kind of what I sort of hope to do here, I think for me the place to start here is this sort of intuition that I think a lot of us probably share, that like something's a little off here. So we've sort of had this sort of like ever tightening need for spending restraint across successive governments, all the while our public goods and services deteriorate, retreat around us, and we are asked to believe that different or better or more is impossible or imprudent in some way. And I'm going to do that thing when I say like one word so frequently that it starts to sound weird and like distorts in your ears and becomes something strange, and that word is like credibility. So I want to start by asking if this is really credible. Surely this can't be right. I think that's an intuition that a lot of us will share. And so I think what I mostly want to do today is affirm that intuition, give some sort of grounding to it, sort of try to cut through the narratives that are pretty omnipresent. And yeah, I hope you'll come away with firmer in that intuition, that recent spending constraint is not inevitable, and that retreating, disintegrating public services are not inevitable either. And that the logics that take us further down that path, if they feel mystical and hard to comprehend, it's because they don't fully stack up to scrutiny. And this is a talk brought by Tax Justice Aotearoa, so and it's in a seminar series called Why We Need More Revenue, so no prizes for guessing where we'll be going with this. But forgive me for a somewhat circuitous route there. Future speakers in the series will go into specific areas in detail, and they're far better qualified to do that than I am. But I'll hope to take up some of the aspects of the macro picture that sort of animates in the background, and try and untie some of the cumbersome, knotty problems and concepts. So hopefully, when it comes to the future speakers, you don't have to have the sort of macro questions sort of hanging heavily in the back of your mind, and we can go forth confidently knowing that if we are strategic, deliberate, and willing, we can have nice things. So just to, give a graph for things that we already know, government consumption as a ratio of private consumption, so we can think of this as how much weight the government puts on itself and consumption, and we can see how that's sort of retreated, and it only sort of pitches up in response to shocks. So we've got the GFC and Christchurch earthquakes, and we've got COVID there, and then we've got ever tightening thereafter, and all the specifics of what's in there we all kind of know well. I won't do a sort of laundry list of, I won't do a super cut of cuts, because we all know them well enough. And we can see the sort of the broad macro picture of some of the fiscal indicators. We've got our operating balances, and I'll give some more definitions so that we can use those confidently in a second. But we are perfectly aware, I think, in much of the commentary and discourse that there's an emerging structural deficit and relatively high debt that has popped up in response, quite obviously, to COVID, among other things, which we'll get into. So how have governments, successive governments, explained themselves and have sort of appealed to the necessity of spending constraint? And it's always in reference to a deteriorated fiscal position, and we need to secure that urgently for a sort of stable macroeconomic environment. And there's some sort of intuition offered that that's good for all of us. There's high debt, there's a structural deficit, and there's a need for fiscal buffers. And things that we want are not attainable without those. And Chris Luxon offered me a gift the other week. He said the words immutable laws of economics. which I'm delighted at, because that sounds awesome. Having immutable laws, it's so nice. He goes, it's a known economic prescription and we know how it works. And I was like, oh, thank God somebody knows how it works. I've been hanging around with people who spend a lot of time thinking about these things, and none of them have ever thought of anything as immutable. This is really convenient. To me, all of these things seem highly contingent, very institutionally contingent, theoretically contestable, and we know very little about them at all. So I'm glad somebody knows what they're doing. So yeah, the big picture today is trying to invert, put the horse back before the cart, rather than having the cart before the horse on fiscal responsibility and the delivery of public goods. We have at the moment this sort of downward pull via fiscal responsibility that sort of takes our delivery of public goods and services down with it, whereas we should be thinking about the goods and services that we want to deliver and building a fiscal position that can deliver them. That's what fiscal responsibility should be for. And what else do I have in my notes about this? So we'll start by trying to go through what makes a debt position vulnerable and acceptable. Is the sort of current catastrophizing about the debt position, is that well-founded, and what does that mean? And then we'll move on to the structural deficit and talk about what is shrouded in that. And then we'll talk about how we can sort of get back through the indicators, through fiscal indicators, to something real, and see how that can be sort of mobilized so that we can have nice things. Does that sound okay? Does that sound fun? So get some definitions in place at the outset. I'm sure there's people with wide range of expertise in the room, and some people will have far better ways of explaining these things than I do, but some won't. So I'm going to try to sort of make sure we're all coming along together. The government issues bonds, it takes out loans from financial institutions, and the primary market auctions for government securities. There are 8 banks that can buy government bonds, and then they diffuse them further into secondary markets. And there are 2 reasons, to simplify slightly, that the government takes out debt, and that is so it can do capital expenditure to build assets, and then to bridge the gap that it leaves when it has a deficit. And the deficit is the difference. Oh, well, you don't necessarily call it a deficit. Only when it's negative is it called a deficit. The other side of it would be called the surplus, and that's just simply the difference between current revenue and current expenditure. So yeah, surplus and deficit are probably words everybody hears a lot and get thrown around. There's lots of different surpluses and deficits. The fiscal one is the one that we're interested in at the moment. And when it's positive, it's a surplus. When it's negative, it's a deficit. The word structural is doing a lot of work here. So what structural means is that it's not just a cyclical problem that we're thinking about. It's not just that we're in a recession or that's causing us our revenue to fall short. It's something. It's a deeper imbalance between the two. And the other thing that appeals for the need for fiscal consolidation, often referred to as fiscal buffers, and that's just the difference. That's just space for more borrowing should a shock appear. There's not a magical account called the fiscal buffer. It's just space from a sort of theoretical limit to borrowing that we need to stay under, so we can move up into that should we need to. It's about preserving favourable borrowing conditions for should we need to suddenly ratchet up borrowing, say COVID. All those definitions sound kind of useful and like we can use them confidently. Cool. So we have a fiscal framework that tries to secure for us fiscal sustainability, tries to make sure that our fiscals are sustainable. We'll get to what sustainable fiscals mean. The things that operate through in New Zealand are a fiscal strategy, the Public Finance Act, and fiscal rules. So according to the stipulations of the Public Finance Act, a government will set fiscal rules. It will announce them usually twice a year. Usually it tries to reconfirm them rather than change them. And these are some of the ones we have in place at the moment. They usually concern a debt level and something to do with the operating balance being that thing that could be in surplus or deficit. And the purpose of all of this together is to secure fiscal sustainability. So I think the thing to understand about the fiscal rules is that the fact that we have them is more important than what they are. The fact that we make a commitment and keep them has the function of anchoring expectations for investors and showing that government can make a commitment and keep it as the crux of fiscal responsibility and sustainability, more so than any particular level is. So keep that in mind going forward. Yes, as I get slightly ahead of myself, fiscal rules are made not in reference to economic facts. They're made in reference to what is credible. So when we're thinking about what a reference point for a debt rule might be, the 40% that is the current sort of debt ceiling, what catastrophe do we suppose lies beyond there? I think worth noting when I point to the 40% is that's the current government's particular choice. The Treasury's recommendation for some time has been 50% as a debt ceiling, and that they brought through analysis in 2022 when Grant Robertson changed the fiscal rules then. Coming down to 40% is simply this government's preference, which shows to some extent that we're not working with economic facts here, we're working with judgments. So the reference point is what the Treasury considers that potential investors are going to find credible. When they might get nervous, when they might perceive higher risk, and when lending might become less forthcoming or on less favourable conditions beyond some point. That's the catastrophe that they have in mind if you sort of start to exceed debt levels. And I've got some more notes on this later on. But what's important here is they're not deterministic and they're not in reference to economic facts, but to a case that you can make, a credible case, preferably. When they do that calculation when Treasury arrived at the 50% in the 2022 revision of the analysis, they did this. I'm not going to make you do maths. This is just here to show that I can do maths. And so they do it that they take an IMF procedure that has been popularised widely. It's very common and used internationally. It's the basis for a lot of the EU's fiscal sustainability analysis and the Maastricht Treaty that confirms the whole EU fiscal framework. So it's the internationally common approach. So the bit along the bottom, which I hope is visible to people on Zoom, despite some of the things that are concealing it on my screen. But what it says down there is that there's no benefit to public spending through debt or through revenue factored into the establishment of this reference point for what a sustainable fiscal position would be. So there's a couple of oddities to picking a reference point for what a sustainable fiscal position would be. And to me, that it reflects an unbalanced consideration of risks, an unbalanced consideration of fiscal and economic risks. So the first is that there is no benefit to public investment incorporated into the computation that sort of allows us to recommend the 50% level, or allows Treasury to recommend a 50% level. Increases in debt or even current spending in that computation is money out the window. It's costly. It's never beneficial. You're not getting anything for that. And I think what this underweights is that underinvestment is just as risky as excessive debt is. And we should consider that equally threatening to fiscal sustainability given the real impacts in the economy. And then I'll get into some of my gripes with the size of the buffers that we build in, the space that we build in for some sort of resilience. But I think there's better notions and approaches to resilience that would make more sense. So I'm going to go through each of these things in sequence. And yes, I think I called this talk the value of public expenditure. So I think I'd probably begin there and build off that. So yeah, as I just noted a moment ago, there are no growth, resilience, or any other benefits to spending when we're trying to decide a reference point for what fiscal sustainability is. Public debt can only be a problem. It can never be helping you to do something. Yeah, there is in some of these models demand stimulus. So when we say that, it's sort of the fact that the government has spent some money on the demand side is going to do things But it's not like there's a sort of future benefit to unlocking, say we have roads or we have trains or something. None of these things offer any sort of supply side benefits in terms of lifting our productivity or reducing the severity and frequency of shocks if you're doing, say, flood enhancements or seismic strengthening. So all spending, be it from revenue or from debt, is money out the window, it's burned. So this reflects quite a pessimism towards what the state can do. It's the productive capacity in these models is purely something that is owned and operated by the public sector. Only private businesses do have productivity or can invest in and improve that. The state can only be a hindrance to that. Now, the flip side to underestimating any benefit to public spending is underestimating the damage that you do when you don't do enough of it, or the damage that you do when you cut expenditure. So if you underestimate the benefit, you underestimate the damage that you do when you do the opposite. And so naturally, if that's the basis for your advice, you're going to look for ways to not spend money. And that's what we've seen for a number of years, is looking for solutions that get out of using any fiscal levers. They're all about animating the dynamism of the private sector. Tax Justice Aotearoa asked me to go back to David Hall's paper in 2014, which I think there was did you have a talk around it before my time?
Yeah, we brought David Hall out from the PSA, brought David Hall out in 2010 or thereabouts, his first version of that report. Yeah,
so I hadn't read this report before, and I don't blame myself. I was really busy doing NCA Level 2 at the time. But it was quite a startling read for me, who thought sometimes I have like the grand delusion that like I say original things sometimes, but then I'm reading through David's report and I'm like, oh, he's said it all, he's found it all, this is the lit review I tried to do, the thing that comes out of the paper is that there is no shortage of evidence for the economic value of public expenditure. It's not for lack of evidence that the government can do stuff that we plough on, restricting what the government can do. So most of these things are highly intuitive. It's just here to show with a few citations, everyone likes a citation, that even economists know that the government can do things, even though they try to sustain a bit of willful blindness about it. There was also some coverage in that report of some IMF reports from 2012 and some OECD reports, which I thought had some quite stunning lines in them. So yeah, basically sort of quite damning of a non-fiscal response to shocks, especially in recession, or which one of these I like the best? The countries with the best ratings in terms of public sector regulatory framework, which is to say their market friendliness, most far-reaching financial deregulation were the hardest hit economically by the global financial crisis. So even the IMF in 2012, hardly a radical institution, was quite clear that fiscal consolidations, poorly timed and overly aggressive, do an enormous amount of harm at a macro level. So thanks for the point to David's paper, it was great. The Treasury gave me another gift the other day. I haven't read the long-term insights briefing in detail yet, so this is I'll take you through something that I found in the report at a scan that was I thought it was a gift to me, though I haven't read it in detail yet. So there's this modelling exercise undertaken in the long-term insights briefing, where we explore the potential economic and fiscal impacts of different policy responses. And the ELB part of the title here is the effective lower bound. So this is when monetary policy is not being very effective. And so we have 3 different policy alternatives compared. We have lump sum payments to the bottom 80% of the distribution of income. We have some public investment and public works undertaken, and then we have a tax cut for businesses. And they're all of the same proportion of GDP. They're all the same fiscal size, and then we see how those go in the macro models here. So these are tricky charts, and we don't need to understand them fully. I want to draw attention to the light blue line and the black line, which in every one of these move quite similarly. So that's your business tax change and your public works. In all of these models, they're basically indistinguishable from one another. And I think that's the kind of the crux of some of the limits of the modeling basis here, is that a lot of the macro models, because they don't recognize that the public sector or the government can do productive things or do long-term alleviations of constraints to productivity strategically and deliberately, we can't tell the difference between tax cuts and public works. So I loved these charts. So yeah, the basis for the modelling or the effect that they measure and the way they're passed through the macro models is through the demand side, through the way that in which it stimulates people's consumption in the more immediate term. It's not considering the way it might alleviate a constraint by building a new road or making people smarter or resulting in innovation in some sort. None of those things can have an effect in these sorts of models. You can just have these sort of like short-term demand stimulus type responses. So I thought that was indicative of the sorts of limits that we're up against there. And that, I'm sure, sort of like makes it quite clear how vulnerable we are to cuts, and the sort of basis for the sort of that reasoning there. Like it's very available that like if a tax cut and real public works are basically indistinguishable from one another, you'll do the one that improves the fiscal position better, or it's easier politically. It's very like open to opportunism in various ways. But the flip side of underestimating the benefits of public expenditure is the underestimation of the risk to underinvestment. So even in approaching that reference point for what a sustainable fiscal position was in the 2022 analysis, this is a quote, they answer, what is the highest level of net debt to GDP ratio that could be tolerated before we consider debt to be unsustainable? There's no question of what the lowest level of debt that might be tolerated before we consider debt to be unsustainable. And if that is, if low debt or sort of going below some minimal delivery of public goods and services and works, if that's not considered, then you're failing to build resilience to shocks, you're eroding existing capital, and you're allowing resources to be put to unproductive use. So those sorts of things erode the real productive capacity in the economy, and I think that, I have no empirics to back this up, but I think it has something to do with the laggard productivity performance that we've come to know and lament. And then I want to talk a little bit about the buffers. The size of these buffers was first raised to me by Toby, who is sick today, so I wanted to credit him properly. But the 40% buffer, I won't go through the full calculation that Treasury undertakes to get to that 50% debt ceiling here, but they build in a 40% buffer below. They first calculate a maximum sustainable debt level beyond which they believe that financial markets are likely to freak, and then they take a 40% buffer beneath that. Now, what does that give us space for? It gives us space for 2 COVIDs to hit at once. It gives us 23 Cyclone Gabriels at once, 8 Christchurch earthquakes at once. That's an enormous amount of space left. So that is to say we can take on, or 40%, like a 40% debt to GDP buffer, like gives you space to take on that much extra debt that would cover this many sort of the historical shocks that we've known in recent times. So what do we lose when we build in that bigger buffer is investment that we could be undertaking to build real resilience to those sorts of things. So this comes at a direct trade-off with seismic strengthening, with flood barriers, and with other investments that might reduce the frequency of shocks. In fact, to invest in any of those things, anything that would represent real resilience, a real investment in the strength of the asset, of the built environment, say, so that it can reduce the severity or frequency of the shocks. That would actually be counter to this notion of resilience. if we were to raise debt by 5% in order to do seismic strengthening. That would be bad for resilience in this concept, because the only resilience that it sort of has in mind is our ability to borrow at favourable rates when bad things happen. So the size of the buffer that we have might indeed be counter to actual resilience. Yeah, and I think that there's another layer of sort of incredibility to this, in that the idea that doing so allows us to have access to financial markets, borrowing at favourable rates when the time comes, when the shock hits, ignores that financial markets are already pricing in the real risks that they see. They're already pricing in that they know what happens when Nelson floods, and they've already sort of raised premiums on these sorts of things, like insurance costs in these places already go up. So the recognition of the real vulnerability is already factored into our borrowing conditions. So in that sense, to pay in order to alleviate some of the, or to build the real resilience, shouldn't come at the cost of borrowing, and the way that this seems to think that they do, or this approach to this sort of preserving space for borrowing when the time comes, rather than building resilience in advance. So those are my three logics of the way that we sort of establish what a reference point for fiscal sustainability is. And so let me not go there yet. So if then the reference point that we have for fiscal sustainability doesn't bear any resemblance to the real economy, or doesn't correctly represent the way that investment, or what the government does or doesn't do, relates to what is in the real economy, as opposed to just sort of appearing in fiscal indicators, what is a real basis for fiscal sustainability, or what actually would make a fiscal position, the debt and the deficit, sustainable or not sustainable, vulnerable or not vulnerable? And I promise I'm going to get back to tax at some point. I won't spend too long on this circular chart that I was going to go around, because I'm watching the time a little bit. But I'm going to start saying the word credibility lots now, because fiscal responsibility is ultimately about being perceived as a credible lending prospect. So it amounts to investors finding it credible that we're going to pay our debt servicing costs. That's when the conditions for borrowing will be favourable. That's when interest rates will be low and stable. And oftentimes we heard referring in the media to how much of a burden the debt servicing cost is. So there's a need to preserve low costs, and that sort of, whether or not the cost is going to be low, and whether or not the interest rate on the government debt is going to be low, is about the creditworthiness of the government, and that's about whether or not its spending plan is being found credible. That might have something to do with the size of the debt. That, of course, the size of the debt is going to be an important factor in how much the debt servicing cost is. But it's not the only factor, and in fact it's generally sort of second or third order when it comes to considering whether a government can credibly do what it might promise to do. More important are its productive capacity, its resilience, its productivity, and the institutional strength, its governance quality, its policy credibility, and these sorts of transparency and accountability arrangements are consistently highlighted as a strength in New Zealand. The external position is quite important as well. So if we're narrowly fixated on what the fiscal indicators say about fiscal sustainability, we're missing what sits behind that, which is a real economy and real people doing real things. So if I go back to my little circular thing, the crux of debt sustainability is avoiding spirals. So if interest rates reflect what the market says is the default risk of the sovereign is, if it starts to perceive something as not a credible plan, it will jack up the interest rates, which makes the debt servicing burden heavier, which means it requires a greater proportion of the current revenue, which causes the deficit then feeds into the debt, because as you'll recall from earlier, if you have a deficit, it must be met from debt. So the debt then rises as deficits flow into it, and as the debt increases, investors perceive an increased risk. And so if you get this sort of spiral going of the sort of interest rate going up, the deficit getting worse, the debt going up, you get into what's called a debt spiral. And avoiding that is kind of the crux of debt sustainability. So we may recall a particular lettuce from 2022. The way this has been the most sort of salient and severe example of that sort of that potential for the spiral dynamic to start to emerge, and how important the bond market reaction is hanging as a spectre in the mind of the policymaker. So to explain the lettuce, I'm sure most of us were perhaps had some awareness of the great longevity of this lettuce at the time. The idea being that Liz Truss made a wonderfully incredible fiscal move, and then in the sort of lapse before she resigned, this popped up. I can't remember what the news site was. Daily Star, there it is. Seeing if the lettuce would disintegrate before Liz Truss resigned. The lettuce won. So what Liz Truss did was an enormous tax cut, or a series of enormous tax cuts, with no sort of commensurate spending cut on the other side. So bond markets reacted severely and immediately, and the bond rate leapt up from the interest rate on the sovereign debt leapt up from 3.5 to 4.5 within days. So the government's borrowing cost was going to skyrocket, and that was going to sort of weigh heavily and it was going to unravel the entire fiscal position. So what was the market response driven by? Because I think this brings into view why it's not just the fiscal indicators that make something credible or incredible. Yes, that was there, that the numbers didn't quite stack up because this enormous tax cut was not going to be met by any reduction in expenditure, so it didn't add up in that sense, but it was more to do with the inflation fears in a already inflationary environment, the idea that markets didn't think that it was credible that this was going to lead to growth in the way that Liz Truss was trying to represent it as, and it also bypassed most of the ordinary governance procedures, so it was just a chaotic thing to do, and consensus is that the reaction is mostly to how chaotic this was, and I think notable that it's a tax cut that provoked this sort of reaction, not an increase in taxes. So creditworthiness is, as I mentioned a moment ago, about institutional strength and economic dynamism, and when it comes to fiscal matters, the debt indicator is more a backstop to the deficit than anything else. The deficit is what's seen as reflecting those more fundamental governance concerns. A persistent structural deficit is a red flag because it's a more fundamental imbalance and it flows into the debt. The debt is a sort of second order consideration relative to the deficit. And an inability to sort of resolve a structural deficit can point to political failings or governance failings in terms of the need to do so, to get that through. The bond market raises its eyebrows saying, are you willing to do what needs to be done here? And the deficit is a matter of tax adequacy. It's a matter of being willing to tax the amount that you need to get the things that you want. And it's being willing to tax in such a way that builds your institutional strength and economic dynamism as well. And also to be fixated on debt as a level is ignorant to the composition of that debt and the source of it. As I said earlier, that markets are smart enough to know real resilience in your real economic capacities from space to borrow. They're also smart enough to know when your debt's being put to good use or put to bad use. Debt can be productive when it's sort of used in a strategic, deliberate way, when it's part of a plan. Debt that results from a fundamental imbalance and inability to have adequate tax is not looked upon favourably. Yes, debt for productive investments as part of a plan, debt that responds to a crisis, say COVID-19, these things are considered highly credible, and that's what must be done. Debt that reflects a failure of governance or a failure to tax is not looked upon favourably. That's vulnerable debt. So yeah, just to underscore with a chart, debt that comes to fund capital expenditure on purpose, that's going to be looked upon favourably and doesn't pose a threat. Debt that results from a fundamental imbalance in tax, that's not looked upon favourably. That's a vulnerability. So how does New Zealand stack up? New Zealand has very strong credit ratings across all of the main ratings agencies, and has done so for a while. I think it's worth noting, just to underscore the point, that debt being used for a shock response as it was through COVID resulted in a credit rating upgrade for New Zealand. We were considered a more credible lending prospect because our response was strong and it was seen as credible. The fiscal response, the real response, what the government did through COVID was looked upon very favourably, and the credit rating was actually raised. That was the last time our credit rating was raised. And when Grant Robertson raised the debt rule through the 2022 advice, he said that we're going to shift the debt. The previous debt ceiling was at either 30 or 40%. He lifted it to 50. The bond market and the financial actors didn't raise an eyebrow at that whatsoever. That was considered credible. So all this to underscore that things done reasonably, deliberately, strategically, don't provoke a reaction. Things that are done chaotically, that are not credible, do provoke a reaction. So we should think very carefully next whenever we're being told that debt levels are a catastrophe. There's a lot beneath that. In particular, beneath that is the deficit, is tax adequacy. So we're vulnerable, like to represent the debt level as vulnerable is to sort of give yourself away because you know that you've gotten there by sustaining a structural deficit. What else do I have to say about that? So we have real economic risks to fiscal sustainability. As I've said a few times, the markets are able to see what's really there to some extent. And there are the real risks that they continuously identify are things that are in the real economy, and that's far more important than what's in the fiscal indicators. The fiscal metrics, the debt, and of the fiscal metrics, they care about the deficit, not the debt. And they're far more likely to raise problems in the real economy, whether that be the productivity stagnation, the extent of private debt. Private debt is at 170% of household income. The way that there's outward migration, low performing infrastructure, and the tax reform paralysis. These are the things that ratings agencies are far more likely to identify, and other sort of international commentators commentate on. The debt level is not the catastrophe here. And all of these things, the real risks that they are, they require public spending to address. These are not things that we can pin our hopes to the mast of the private sphere to solve, because these things are not going to be have sort of benefits that can be privately captured. These are sort of diffuse positive externalities that spill over across wide territories. They're not up for private capture, really. That's why it must be the government that does these things. To sort of, these are not all problems that we can just throw money at, that we have to be more deliberate about it. That's why a tax cut's not going to solve these issues, because that's just a throwing of money. This requires a more deliberate series of interventions that's coordinated. That's why it must be the government. So addressing the real risks requires more spending, not less. And if we're willing to increase slightly, just on standard metrics, the fiscal risk by taking on slightly more debt, or being willing to spend from current revenue, in order to address real economic risk. That's not a net increase in risk. That's just a switch from one type of risk to another. And if the enduring benefits come through, then it's a reduction of risk in the long run. Tax is always highlighted as a vulnerability in New Zealand, but for the effect that it has in the real economy, as well as its level itself. The way that it interacts with investment incentives in New Zealand to contribute to capital shallowness and distortions to investment are continuously highlighted. And once again, the persistent deficit is the most salient risk there. So this was also in the LTIB the other day, but the chart I note is from the long-term fiscal statement, which was in 2021. And this is precisely the sort of curve that you'd expect to see with spiraling debt. The way that it curves upwards like that looks like it's going to go on forever and just be vertical at some point. So that's assuming no policy change, which is to say no tax policy change, which is to say with revenue remains inadequate, which is to say if we keep having to finance structural deficits with debt, then we will not have sustainable debt. Our debt remains vulnerable as long as the deficit remains. And then to think about just quite how vacuous sometimes the fiscal indicators are in terms of what really sits behind them and how it's a sort of a mistake to focus on them without sort of digging into it and thinking critically about it. A couple of different lines on some charts. So across the top are the operating indicators, Obergau, and the primary balance. The difference between the two is whether or not we're including the interest payments, debt servicing costs, and then we've got some debt indicators on the bottom. So what line is what? What I'm comparing here is the government's projections through BFU in 2025, so this year, released in May, and just to represent the difference possible, to represent that we can have nice things, I've just taken up the Green Party's green budget, and I've run some projections on them using the same modelling infrastructure that the Treasury uses in its fiscal strategy model, just to take the scale of current revenue and current expenditure and capital investment that is represented in the green budget, and supposing that we did that forever. So they've just given the first 4 years over the forecast period, but I've sort of take it from its end point and say, what if we just took that scale of public expenditure into the future? What would that do to fiscal indicators using the same models that Treasury does? So the green little band and the grey line are from the Green Party's budget, whereas the black line and the blue line are two different scenarios that are included in BFU. The difference between the two BFU scenarios are whether or not you include the $36.7 billion cut to capital expenditure. That's the difference between two of the scenarios included there. That's just in the projection period, so it's sort of not necessarily a policy commitment that the government's made, but I will note that they've assumed through the assumptions in the fiscal strategy model that they're going to undertake nearly 40 billion less in capital expenditure than they had indicated in their primary scenario in the half-year fiscal and economic update. So looking at, let's start with the primary balance up here. The greens lines and the which one's which? The government's lines are pretty much indistinguishable. And then when we switch over to the operating balance, the only differences arise because of the interest repayments on the debt. And then when we look at the debt, there's a little bit more of a difference, but that's because of the scale of capital expenditure being undertaken. That's the main difference that arises here. The reason that the primary balance stays pretty much on track is because of revenue. And then that means that the difference in debt that we see in the bottom rows is far more credible debt, because it's not the reflection of having to cover the deficit repeatedly into the future because of a structural tax inadequacy. It's about something deliberate, which says to me that there's far less likely to be an interest rate reaction to that. It's going to be seen as credible because it's going to be signalled. This is, of course, under the caveat that it delivers what it promises to deliver, which I guess will always be the criticism there. But yes, just to sum up those points, if I missed anything there, the main difference between these two budgets is the scale of tax. And in those projections, the Greens budget passes all the normal stylized tests of what fiscal sustainability is because of the large scale of tax that it takes up. They look basically the same on fiscal indicators, but one of these things is not like the other when it comes to the delivery of public goods and services, and one of these things is not like the other when it comes to expanding the state's real economic capacity. So that's the scale of difference that can be hidden behind seemingly identical fiscal indicators. Now the takeaway isn't that there is no real reference point for what fiscal sustainability is, and it's all just sort of whatever you can make a case around, and then you can do infinite debt, and it's all good. There are real things out there. Not everything. There's a lot that is not real, and that is a sort of a product of what is credible. There are some things that are real. So there is people's labour, there is natural resources, there's real built infrastructure, and there's our technological capabilities. These are things that are really productive. That's in the real economy, and those do form constraints on what we can deliver. Real constraints for what we can deliver. You can't just sort of throw money at things and hope that a train appears. But these are constraints. These are real constraints that can be dynamically alleviated with public investment. That's what being strategic means. Is that you identify the things that are constraining your ability to deliver what it is that you want to deliver, and you sequentially invest in alleviating those constraints. You want to build more housing. The problem isn't that you can't get enough money, it's that you can't get enough gibboard, or you can't get enough nails, or you can't get enough builders. Why can't you get these things? It's either because you haven't built the skills yet, and therefore you need to undertake sort of sequential investment in building those skills over a long period of time, or it's because somebody else has a claim to those resources. Somebody else is building a mansion. So if there are things that you want to get, you have to be deliberate about getting them. That's what being strategic means. So that's how we get nice things. By not catastrophizing about the fiscal position unnecessarily, or being more nuanced and specific about what the vulnerabilities in the fiscal position are, namely the lack of tax. Once you secure tax adequacy, any spending that you do from current revenue is stronger because it doesn't contribute to the deficit, and any spending that you do through debt is less vulnerable because it is on purpose. Rather than reflecting an underlying failure to tax. That allows us to do what we need to do. And the main thing to take away here is that there are things that, why do we need more revenue? Because there's things that only the state can do. There's things that we can't hope to do without revenue. Deliberate strategic reconstruction of a state capacity to deliver the things that we want to do. If we're serious and deliberate about doing them, we can find the sequential sort of way to alleviate the real constraints on delivering those things. Because I don't think it's credible to say that things that have been possible in the past are no longer possible, or no longer responsible, or no longer prudent. If we collectively aspire to do something, we can find a way to do it if we're serious about it. And being serious about it starts with tax. Thanks, guys. I think I've successfully crowded out most of the time for questions.
Yes, we are out of time. Thank you again, Tayla, for speaking with us today and sharing your knowledge. I think it's fantastic news that it's possible for us to have nice things. If there are questions, you can send them through to contact@tjanz.org. tjanz.org. Brilliant. And the session has been recorded, so we'll try and make that available as well. Yes, Louise?
Will the slides be available as well?
I can make the slides available.
So do we have through the contact through the TJA website for the slides?
Yep, we should also send an update in the next newsletter as well for anyone who's signed on there. So that's also a final little push. If you're not with our newsletter already, please do. You can also keep up with us on socials. Also, the next item in the series with Shamabel Yakub will be on 16th September, so we look forward to seeing most of you then. Cool. Thanks, everyone.
Let me